goods and services off of the Goss plan directed plan for that enterprise for the entire economy, and that this would lead to fewer supply shortages, newer products and services that people wanted, etc. Let me just give you one kind of simple example of how this worked when it actually worked as intended, which was not very often. So in Latvia, for instance, and this was how it was supposed to work. So you had a kolkhoz, a collective farm, and some of these were huge enterprises, these collective farms. And so Gorbachev has his directive on enterprises, which says, okay, guys, if you want to produce something else, if you've met your target plans and you want to produce something else, go ahead, you do that, keep the profits. So one of the things that this one kolkhoz in a little place called Adagi in Latvia starts to produce are potato chips. Not just big truckloads of potatoes, but they actually begin to process them into a higher value-added product, potato chips. And they make a ton of money. And the next thing you know, they're all driving around in new Toyota SUVs. and to this day, this potato chip company is the biggest one in Latvia. There's another kolkhoz that starts making beer. So that's how it's supposed to work. Now, how it also worked in the most dysfunctional ways was it opened the economy to widespread, wide-scale theft. So if you were a more corrupt-minded director of an enterprise, well, what could you do? Well, you could start, say, an import-export business on paper. And, okay, well, maybe that can be a good thing. And so you then started to work with the KGB. Why is that? Well, you were going to need some help in terms of navigating things like international banking systems, so that you could figure out how to trade your goods, get payments for them, all of the rest. Well, the only people who knew how to do that in the Soviet Union were the Czechists, because the Communist Party of the Soviet Union used to fund things like revolutions and all the rest around the world, and they needed to know how to shift money around and get it into the pockets of people they wanted to get it to. So the KGB begins facilitating the creation of these networks, allowing some of these import-export enterprises to come into being. And what many directors of enterprises quickly learn is that they can use this to let's say their enterprise has allocated a certain amount of oil for whatever it is that they're producing. Well, they can take that oil and, they're getting it for next to nothing. They can sell it on global markets at the global world price and just capture that entire arbitrage between the state price and the world price, pocket that cash, deposit it in an account in London, and no one will know about it. Now, the other thing they can do is they can start creating their own commercial banks, and the commercial banks can actually create their own money. It's not a nice thing to be able to do. And then the state bank would have to cover any losses. They would have to cover this money creation of these commercial enterprises that were being created. Now, of course, this creates a class of call them oligarchs if you like, but people who are involved in the shadow economy. Let me give you, if I can test your patience here, one example of this in Latvia. So Latvia, because of its location on the Baltic Sea, it's facing westward. It is just a 10, 12-hour ferry ride from Stockholm, even less so to Helsinki, and by plane, less than an hour. It is one of the chief transshipment points for Soviet raw materials to points west. So the Soviet export trade in oil, for instance, even the legitimate one. The chief port for that is in a place called Ventspils, which is another Baltic Latvian port. Now, with all of these new enterprises that are emerging as a consequence of Gorbachev's reform all over the dozen time zones of the Soviet Union, you create also an opportunity to make offshore banks in the Soviet Union itself and the post Soviet republics themselves. It's no mistake that in 1990, the first legal in the Soviet Union currency exchange gets established in Riga by a couple of enterprising Komsomol members. These are young members of the Communist Party. They're all well connected because they have this national network. And there are these two guys, Kargan and Krasovitz, and they begin shuttling rubles, Soviet rubles, between Riga and St. Petersburg and Moscow by train. And then there are small little differences in the value of that currency between these three locations on the black market. And they're doing this by duffel bag and train. But by 1990, they create a legal currency exchange. And then money from all of the entire Soviet Union starts coming to them as these enterprise directors and cooperative directors start converting their Soviet rubles into hard Western currencies, British sterling and US dollars. It's an incredible transformation that is underway. And they end up creating the largest in the 1990s and up until the 2008 crisis bank in Latvia. It was called Podex. And they both used to advertise right on their sign in the early 1990s. We take all currencies, we ask no questions. And another sign that they had from the early 1990s was choose us, we're closer than Switzerland. I mean, they were very open about what it is they were doing. But at any rate, this opened up the entire former space of the Soviet Union to these shady characters that were selling off the country's natural wealth, pocketing the cash, and then using offshore banks in places like Riga to then redirect that money to places like London and New York for safekeeping. Now, where it has relevance for the, say, post 2008 period is that these Chekist figures, the Silvecki, who we are always hearing about, the KGB, the people who really helped to create these new rich guys, begin to get resentful of the fact that they were left out of the deal. And so Putin begins to bring them back into the deal, and they begin targeting, well, even before 2008, when we had Khodorkovsky being arrested and putting into jail. They begin to make their move against these 1990s oligarchs, and they begin to replace them.
Yes, and in fact, just to finish up that point, can you explain, just because people probably do encounter this from time to time, can you explain the scheme whereby major state industries were sold off through so-called shares? Can you
Yeah,
explain how that worked? Because that was one of the main mechanisms that created the oligarchs that we talk about now, who have, of course, as you just mentioned, subsequently either fallen in line with Putin or, as in the case of Khodorkovsky, fled.
right. Yeah, so this is the infamous loans for shares scheme. The infamous loans for shares scheme. So, how it was decided, now this is post Gorbachev, how it was decided during the early part of the Yeltsin rule to redesign the Soviet economy was to put these massive state enterprises in the hands of a new ruling economic elite. And so what they did was they held auctions. I mean, this is how privatizations are supposed to work in terms of textbook, explanations of how they're supposed to work. You're supposed to have an auction. You're supposed to get the best price that you can for the asset, and then you become the owner of that asset. Well, there's no reason that the state could not have just kept these assets. And it did with a few, such as Gazprom. But the process was entirely rigged. I mean, all you had to do in the context of an environment that was in the early 1990s capital starved is to provide now I'm referring to the banks. You had to just direct loans to the figures that you wanted to be able to, often figures connected to yourself, to buy those assets for pennies on the dollar, and give them just enough money to do that. So it was an entirely corrupt process that transferred this vast store of national wealth over to just a few people in this loans for shares scheme. So um, uh, you combine that with the destruction of the Soviet ruble, again designed to wipe out the savings of everyone. And then, of course, you also had privatization vouchers. I mean, rather, these vouchers that were supposed to be able enable everyday citizens to be able to invest in the economy. Well, I mean, come on, what are you going to do with these things? So if you're an average person and you have some of these vouchers, you just sell them for a bottle of vodka or whatever to somebody who then scoops them all up, and then they are used to help purchase major assets as well. So it was just a corrupt transfer of the entire national public wealth represented by state enterprises to a handful of oligarchs.
And just to finish up that point before we return to this issue of Gorbachev and the final years of his tenure and the final years of the Soviet Union, I want to mention also the role that well, how do I want to say this? The ways in which the transfer of wealth from what had been the Soviet state into the hands of this new class, the ways in which that then creates the modern Russia that we have today, because that is an important point. It's not just that people got rich, it's that an entire political and economic and even social structure is erected on top of all of these corrupt dealings and practices that were going on in a relatively short period of time. So I guess, can you finish up the point by just helping us to understand how the current system in Russia that we see today is really built on this foundation?
Oh yeah, it's as you've said, it's an oligarchic model, and it's one in which uh, these state enterprises that became public property uh, became the true centers of power in the country. And then, of course, over time, Putin takes this system, um, and he does not dismantle it. I mean, he makes it, I guess, more stable to a certain extent. So, in other words, the privatizations of the 1990s were kind of wild, and there were lots of still competing figures that were taking each other out in the literal sense of the term. And he more or less institutionalizes it, and brings the more independent minded members of the oligarchy to heel and restore